In this video, I'm going to talk about the different steps involved in quantitative finance projects. So it all depends as to what kind of project that you are doing and in which kind of forms. But there are some generic steps that one must know in order to build a good quant finance project. If you are an absolute beginner, somebody who is just starting out and hasn't really worked, you will find this video pretty useful. Even if you are someone who has just started, right? You have worked in a bank or in an insurance firm or an investment firm for let's say a couple of years. You are a beginner. You're still a beginner, and you will find this video useful. Okay, as I have said, it all depends as to what kind of project and which kind of companies, because not all quant finance projects are exactly the same. So it all depends on a number of things, but there are some generic steps involved. I'm going to discuss about that. I'm also going to tell you as to how things would be different in different places, as in some projects in investment firms would be very different from compared to the projects in large commercial banks or fintechs. So that's something also to keep in mind while we learn this. Right. So okay, let me start with this example of a project at a commercial bank where you are building models to assess the capital requirement for a trading portfolio. Right. So you're working in the market risk department and you were asked that for a given asset class, what would be the required level of capital uh, that the bank needs to hold for a given period of time, right? So that's the project that you will be building, right? So the first thing to note is any project in a large commercial bank is always with keeping in mind the regulations around the project. So having good understanding of regulations is absolutely important before do anything and everything in large commercial banks. That's not the case in many of these investment firms, which are less regulated, I would say, especially the private investment firms. The pension funds are all also quite heavily regulated, but many private investment firms are not, regulated as much as the banks are regulated, right? So if you're working at the banks, okay, first thing to do is first, understand the regulations around the projects or whatever you're doing. That is a bare minimum, right? Even before you start gathering requirements as to you think about the planning and everything, it's important to understand the relevant regulations for that project. And the relevant regulation would also depend on the jurisdiction the bank is located in. A bank may be headquartered in London, but if it is located in Singapore, then it has to comply with the local regulation over there in Singapore. So, you not just have to understand the global level regulation, as in the regulations applied to the headquarter, which is in London. You also have to understand the regulations, local regulations in Singapore for that particular type of project. All right, so understanding of after you have fair bit of understanding, you should come up with a proper project plan. But even before that, it's important to have a word with all the stakeholders just to understand the requirements. And the requirements are not always very clear at the beginning, actually, and that's the reason why you talk to quite a number of stakeholders, not just your immediate stakeholders, but even the stakeholders who probably will not be using the project or will not, you know, or be, connected to the project in any way directly. But even if you have, people who will be using the outcome of the project indirectly, you will still talk to them, right? So this is very important to know because if there is a significant change towards the end of the project or even at the middle of the project, it is very difficult to then make changes, and that brings a lot of cost. So very important is to connect with the stakeholders, as many as possible. Okay, so it's important to gather the information well in advance, just to be clear, what are the things that you will do as part of the project, right? Then comes, creating a project plan, proper project plan. It's very similar to you do any project plan in any kind of work, may not be just in the field of finance, but even if you're working in IT, you have a project plan, right? You are working the tech, in the product development, you have a project plan. Now, let me tell you that in many of these IT projects, software development projects, you have dedicated project managers, program managers, writing the documents, right? Project plans and requirement documents and so on. But in quantitative finance projects, many a times, not always, as a quant, you have to do everything. Or probably a senior quant would do all these things, right? Most of the junior folks don't get to talk to stakeholders and create project plans and do presentation to senior stakeholders and do budgeting and all these activities. But most of these senior quants actually, or lead quants, do these activities. Okay, but rarely have I seen where you have dedicated project managers assigned. There are actually, it depends on what kind of banks you're working at. In European banks, you have this concept of, even dedicated project managers, even in quant projects, whereas in the US banks, there's, or even the UK banks, you don't see that many uh, places, right? For large projects, you probably have a dedicated project manager who probably is not a quant, probably doesn't understand too much of quantitative or finance stuff, but he's or she is a specialist project manager who will be taking care of all the administrative activities related to the project. All right, so that's after that, it's important also to present the project plan to the senior stakeholder and get their approval. That's absolutely important. Have a committee. The project plans will have everything about the requirements, the end users, the governance, very important, acceptance criteria. That means when will the project will be accepted, right? So these are some of the things that you will care about while creating the project plan. Okay. Okay. And then you will have a team, start gathering data, and then go ahead with building models and doing host of other things. Okay. So that then the fourth step would be to, well, the project plan itself will have a definition of done and how many people will be working, who will be the lead, who are the stakeholders, what governance to be followed, and everything. All that is done. Then you'll go ahead with the data collection. Data collection also has a component called data cleaning, because most of the times in the large banking organization, you will see that the quality of the data is really, really poor. So data cleaning or data remediation is also a word that is used quite often in the banking world. Uh, it starts, and that actually takes quite a number of months, if not years. In some cases, even it can take like years to collect data, to clean data. So that's something to keep in mind. People coming from non-financial background, people who have worked in other industry and not in finance, they will be surprised to know how much emphasis is given on the quality of the data. Because unlike in other industries where you can get away with bad quality data if you have done a good model, and the emphasis is less on cleaning and ensuring that the quality of the data is good. But in the field of finance or any kind of finance, it's very, very important that the quality of the data should be good. Otherwise you will never get an approval from the regulators to use the models, and there will be proper scrutiny of that. The next step would then be to to be sure about the methodology to be used. Well, during the process of data cleaning itself, people already um, discuss the methodology to be used. And in many banks, you have dedicated methodology teams that takes care of the methodology, and you just have to use the procedures, relevant procedures, which are like, the different steps mentioned as to how the model should be built. In smaller banks, this luxury is probably not there, and you as a quant analyst has to write your own methodology and get it approved and then use it. Okay, but large banks have their own methodology team, dedicated team of experts, normally highly senior, experienced experts. People who work in the methodology department are basically the people who have long years of modeling experience. So they are the one who have long years of experience, and they write the methodology in accordance with the relevant regulations. Um, and yeah, as a, as somebody who is going to work in such a project, you should be reading those documents. And these are pre-written. It doesn't have these documents are not written during the projects. These are standard documents used within the banks. So these are already written before the project even starts. But you read the documents during the process of at the beginning of the project, and you see what are the things that you will be using, because some methodologies may not be relevant for the given project, right? Then you'll tweak it a bit, or you will ask for exceptions, so on and so forth, right? Because writing methodology is a theoretical work, but you can actually use it in the real world, in the actual world with actual data. You will see that there are issues, and then you start exploring as to what are the alternatives and so on. So that's not a very straightforward as it looks normally. Methodology selection itself is a challenging task itself. Okay, the next thing would be then the model development, right? For model development, either you use proprietary softwares from commercial software companies like MATLAB or SAS, or you use freely available programming languages such as Python and R. So while people, you're collecting data and cleaning data, some people would already have started writing the relevant, code needed for the model building process. What I've seen is that many banks, they invest a lot in creating their own libraries well before the model building process. So you can already use some of the pre-written libraries, procedures and functions. Um, and there's a dedicated team that maintains this library, and these libraries are used across the bank, and these libraries are well reviewed, so you don't have you save a lot of cost, a lot of time in not having to write these libraries yourself, but these are already written by people from other teams, or people who are dedicated for that kind of work, right? So that's actually luxury in large commercial banks, but let me tell you, it's not the thing in many smaller banks. Even in investment firms, you do not, many smaller investment firms, you won't have that luxury. You have to write everything yourself. I remember working for an NBFC long back. We used to write our own modules, and not relying on someone else work. So that's something you will do, which is the more the coding part. And then there will be the model development. Model development is perhaps the development which is the estimation part, basically. It's the easiest perhaps, because the procedure itself is already decided, so you just have to use it, code the procedure, the whatever modeling technique that you are using, you just have to write the proper code around it. And if you have a proper data, you do the estimation. That's not always straightforward. There, I mean, it sounds a bit easy, but there are several sub steps involved, right? If you're building regression type models, you will be checking assumptions, you will be checking whether the variables have good predictive strengths, and that kind of work you will be doing. If you're doing simulation activities like Monte Carlo simulation for market risk related models, then you will be thinking about whether the model performance is good, whether the code is written properly or not, uh, whether it's a parametric estimation, non-parametric estimation. So all these things have to be thought through, clearly thought through before you finalize the modeling estimations and everything. Okay, and in the field of finance, very important to know is that the model building process, especially for the estimation part, is quite different from the modeling process in other industries. Because in other industry, for example, in e-commerce, in oil and gas, in tech, you only care about the predictions and care less about assumptions related to the models and so on. But in the field of finance, because it's a highly regulated field and because the stakes are very high, you always care about every minute aspect of the modeling process. So it's not about using a fancy model, it's about using a simple modeling technique, but ensuring that each and every aspect of the modeling methodology or the entire modeling process is well tested and well verified, scrutinized before it is put to use, right? So estimation process therefore takes quite a bit of time. Methodology point of view, it's straightforward. When you actually do it, it can be a bit daunting because many a times the assumptions are simply not met, or simply not the data is not good enough. And sometimes you see that violation of assumption and then you feel like, okay, how do I correct it, right? And that becomes a challenge, right? Then once the estimation is done, you do a number of assessment. For example, testing the model performance. Model step will be performance testing, performance assessment. Okay, there are many terminologies used for performance assessment. Some call it cross validations, some just validation also. But there can be confusion, right? In some places the people simply use the machine learning terminologies such as cross validation, but it's just ensuring that the model performs well in a new scenario, in a new data, and that's very important. People also do what is known as scenario analysis. That means, okay, if there is a hypothetical scenario, will the model perform well or not in those scenarios? It's not a requirement in all kinds of models, but in certain scenarios, yes, you have to. Technically it's known as stress testing, but it's also done as part of model building, right? Whether you work on market risk side or on credit risk side or operational risk side, many times you have to generate hypothetical scenarios for the models and check the performance, right? There's something called sensitivity analysis that is done. Sensitivity analysis is just to see whether the model parameters behave properly in those hypothetical scenarios or not, and if there is a large deviation from the estimate value, then there's a reason to be concerned, and then you rethink about the model methodology, model estimation, and you try to sort of change quite a number of things just to ensure that the model is not too sensitive to extreme scenarios. Okay, so these are things, and then the model is finalized because you always have multiple types of or multiple sets of models available, and then you obviously then choose one of them, and it's not very straightforward. It's not just about the performance. It's not just about having good metrics to evaluate the model performance. It's also about whether the model is fit for use from a business point of view, whether the business people like the parameters, whether from a practicality point of view, whether the parameters are the variables used are available, and whether they make business sense or not. By the way, these discussions always take place during the model building process and not towards the end. So it's a bit of a back and forth work. You build the model, maybe the first version of the model, you go and talk to the front office people, get their opinion, views, and then make modifications. That happens back and forth before you agree on the final version of the model, right? So model finalization of the model is the last step in the model building process, but there are many other things which are done after that also, right? It's not just about these steps. what comes later is the validation of model. In most regulated company, model validation is a absolute must thing to do. That means there is an independent team within the large bank uh, who will ensure that the model is built properly. They will, redevelop the model in their own way. They will do the re-estimation. They will, check everything, right? The data that you have used, the process that you have followed, the governance that you have followed, and they will write a document, their own opinion about the models after they have done all these checks, right? And this is an independent team. That means you cannot simply influence them, and you will be collaborating with them during this process, and they will be asking you a number of questions regarding the way you have built the model, and they will themselves take the data and verify everything independently, and they will might give you findings and obligations and issues, whatever they call it, for you to solve. That means the model validation team will most likely come up with quite a number of issues with the modeling, with the models and the data that you have used, and then you will come up with a plan as to how and when to resolve these issues. Okay. Oftentimes, there is another step, which is that after the model validation has done the review, there would be another round of review by the audit team. It's actually not done everywhere, but in some places there is also a third line review right after the second, or this is called second line. Okay, second line of defense. It's just a jargon in the finance world. Don't worry about it. It's just that, okay, somebody else other than the modeling people is actually doing the assessment of the model, of the models to be used. That's why it's called second line. The audit is called third line. Okay, and once everything is done, if it is a regulatory model, then it has to go to the regulator before it can be used. But people don't normally wait for that. Then people would go ahead with the implementation, and implementation of models itself is a very very challenging job. That itself is a project, in fact, that requires a video in itself. But that's actually IT implementation. That's where the model engineers or the quant engineers, quant developers work alongside the modelers to implement the models on on an IT platform, right? And there will be user acceptance testing, all the IT testing that will take place. Then UAT, integration testing, all kinds of IT testing will take place, and there will be again a sign off process whether everything is done properly or not. All that will be properly checked, and once you get an approval from the regulator, by the way, regulator will also come and do a proper review, and there also you have to spend quite a bit of time sitting with the regulator and explaining them whatever you have done. And after that, the model will go into production for use, and once that is the case, then there will has to be a plan to periodically monitor the model, especially ensuring that the model is performing well in the production. Okay, so there is going to be the next step would be monitoring of the model, periodic monitoring. It also happens that the monitoring is done by multiple teams. Okay, the validation team will do, and also the model development team, or the front office people will regularly perform some sort of monitoring on the performance of the model. If the models are not performing well, then there will be an initiative to rebuild them or readjust them or recalibrate them. There are various ways in which you can improve the model performance, and that's a process that is followed thereafter. These are basically the steps followed in a quantitative finance project. However, let me tell you that this project that I discuss is a project in a bank. In non-regulated companies such as private investment funds, you do not have many places you have, but you in most places you do not have a dedicated independent validation team to validate the models. It's much faster. The model building process is much faster than what you experience in large regulated financial organizations. In private funds, you yourself will do everything. That means a quant does everything end to end. All the steps that I mentioned, a quant, except for the implementation probably, where you'll have the engineers sitting next to you doing the work. But even in many places, you don't have the engineers. That means you have to do everything, right from requirement gathering, talking to the front office people, to building model, assessing performance, ensuring that everything is done correctly, to implementing the models and do the monitoring and review on a periodic basis. All these steps are taken care of simply by the quants themselves in the smaller, private funds or trading firms, right? So depending on where you work, I think things can be, slightly different, but overall these are some of the steps that you will be coming across if you work as a quant analyst in financial organizations. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.